Welcome back to episode 5 of Hike and Spike, the podcast that stops the clock and gives you coverage on the latest NFL trends. Today, we will be talking about week 3 of the NFL season. So, let's go to the initial take.
So, as you all know, we have an initial take segment in each of our podcast episodes where each of us just gives a small little piece of, information about what's been going on in the NFL. So, I'm going to start off with my initial take, and I'm going to be talking about two very interesting games that went on. So, first of all, I'm going to talk about the Seahawks and Cowboys game. That was a pretty good game. It was very high scoring. The Seahawks ultimately won 38-31, with the Cowboys almost getting a touchdown. They're actually pretty close, but they unfortunately ran out of time. But something that was very interesting in the game was that DK Metcalf pulled what is called a Deshaun Jackson, where I don't know if you guys remember, but a while ago, like years and years ago, Deshaun Jackson was almost in the end zone, but he just threw the ball behind him to like that to celebrate. But the ball actually wasn't in the end zone, so it was a fumble. But DK Metcalf did something kind of similar. Like Russell Wilson threw like a really good 50-yard pass, and DK Metcalf was running, and it was almost a touchdown. But right, at the 5 or 10-yard line, he started slowing down and celebrating. But and I think he held the ball out too. But Trayvon Diggs was still playing really well. He's very aware. He just batted the ball out of his hands, and it went into the end zone. So it just ended up being a touchback for the Cowboys, and that was pretty insane, in my opinion. But that was probably the highlight of that game, in my opinion, because I also just don't like the Seahawks. Yeah, go Niners. But another game that I want to talk about is the Bills and Rams game. This was another pretty good game that was very high scoring, and the Rams almost came back. I believe in the third quarter, the Bills had they had like a 28-3 lead over the Rams, and they almost choked this lead because the Rams combined for nearly 30 points in quarters 3 and 4. But unfortunately, the Bills were able to secure the game. Um, yeah, they just scored like a game-winning field goal, I believe. But yeah, that was really interesting to see how the Bills almost choked that game. But also, it goes to show that the Rams are a pretty good team. They're still not bad. But also, I think something else that I want to note is that Josh Allen, a lot of people have been saying that he's been getting lucky with the matchups. But the matchup against the Rams was very difficult. I think I do agree against like the Jets and the Dolphins, his stats may have been inflated. But against the Rams, I think the fact that he had 4 touchdowns, only 1 interception, goes to show that he still is a really solid quarterback in the league.
Yeah, I'll be talking about two more really interesting games. The first one is Cincinnati versus Philadelphia, our first tie of the NFL season thus far. And I honestly thought that this was a very weird game. Like, it wasn't like super high scoring. It was pretty much back and forth. No team was blowing a lead. But I felt very frustrated when looking at this game. Like, if you look at the stats, you might think, oh my God, Joe Burrow is so good. He had 312 yards, like almost 70% completion percentage and 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. Like, he must have done extremely well, right? But I honestly was like very disappointed in like how Joe Burrow, at least in the first half, he basically didn't do much in the entire first half. He got a field goal like in the middle of the second quarter after like 4 failed possessions. They were mostly 3-and-outs. Then he got a touchdown, which was kind of hugely buffeted by like 2 penalties, which otherwise would have caused another like a field goal or a punt. And then he got a touchdown. So like in the first half, I was really disappointed when looking at Joe Burrow. But then when looking at the next half, he found his main target. He found Tyler Boyd, and Tyler Boyd had an amazing second half, and where he had several huge plays where he caught some big, almost touchdown passes, and then he actually, I think he got, he actually didn't get a touchdown, but he got super close. And I think that Joe Burrow, he still has a lot of room to grow. Carson Wentz obviously has been struggling the entire year. So he continued his struggles. But like the tie to the Bengals is basically like a loss. So I mean, the Eagles really have to figure out what they're doing. The next game I'll talk about is the Chicago Bears versus the Atlanta Falcons. This game was a typical Atlanta Falcons game, especially considering what they always do. So they were up 26-10, and they had the ball with I think like 7 or 8 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and then the Bears substituted Mitchell Trubisky for Nick Foles, and then Nick Foles led a huge comeback, and the Bears ultimately won, pushing them to 3-0. Yeah, so the Bears are 3-0, which is actually a good sign for the Bears, but like their quarterback situation is still a bit of confusion. I think recently they announced that Nick Foles will be replacing Trubisky as starter for Week 4, but we'll see how that goes.
All right, I'm just going to talk about some of the player news that happened this week. Not as many injuries as Week 2, which was ridiculous, but definitely still a few notable ones. But a few players who were inactive and just didn't play in the games at all were Devontae Adams, who's recovering from a hamstring injury. He should probably be playing next week. And then also Julio Jones is also recovering from a hamstring injury, and I think he'll play next week as well. There was also James White sat out again. He's still grieving the loss of his father, which is very unfortunate. It's a completely understandable reason, and it'll be interesting to see how long he does stay out, though. But during the games, the Seahawks lost 2 key players in Jamal Adams and Chris Carson. They both exited the game early, but it doesn't appear that their injuries are like super terrible or anything. Dallas Goedert injured his ankle in the middle of the Bengals game. He's expected to miss a few weeks. A lot of wide receiver injuries as well. Deontay Johnson exited the first quarter. Chris Godwin was sidelined during the second half with a hamstring injury. And then we had John Brown, who left the game early in the first quarter, but he was already, I think, limited before the game. There were definitely some other important injuries, but these are just some of the most notable ones. And now we're moving on to trivia, where I'll ask the other 2 5 questions related to the NFL, 10 points each, multiple choice. And the current scores are I'm in the lead with 60, but I can't get any more points. Rohan has 50, and then finally Aki has 10. So he'll be looking to catch up today. Let's go to the first question. Who was the last non-quarterback to win the MVP? Is it A, Larry Fitzgerald, B, LaDainian Tomlinson, C, Adrian Peterson, or D, Marshall Faulk? And the first answer is from Akilash.
I have no clue. I just put B, LaDainian Tomlinson.
Yeah, LaDainian Tomlinson did win the MVP, but it was unfortunately too long ago. What's Rohan's answer?
Pretty sure AP won an MVP back in the day, like not too long ago. So I'm gonna have to go with him.
Yep, he did win the MVP. It's after that was like been 10 years straight of just quarterbacks. But Rohan moves up to 60, tied with me now. The second question. Which of these iconic NFL moments did not occur in a Super Bowl? Is it A, the Immaculate Reception, B, the helmet catch, C, Philly Special, or D, the tackle? And the first answer is from Rohan this time.
I'm really not sure of this. I just had to put a guess out there, and I just wanted to be the helmet catch.
Yeah, as a Giants fan, I'm quite offended that you don't know that. But yeah, the helmet catch was in the Super Bowl. The next answer is from Akilash.
I don't know what A or D is referring to, so I just went with D, the tackle.
Yeah. D, the tackle did occur in the Super Bowl. It was like a play. It was like the last play. The team was down 6 points, got a reception, but the other team made a tackle at like the 1 yard line to end the game, which is definitely one of the best moments. But yeah, the correct answer was the Immaculate Reception by Franco Harris. Let's go to the next question now. Who is number 1 in the NFL's official greatest players of all time? Is it A, Jim Brown, B, Tom Brady, C, Joe Montana, or D, Jerry Rice? And Rohan has the first answer again.
Man, it's gotta be Tom Brady. He has the most Super Bowl wins.
That is unfortunately wrong. He is on the list. He is somewhere in the top 100, but not at number 1. And we have an answer from Aki now.
I don't know. I mean, I was thinking possibly it was Joe Montana, but like, I guess maybe they don't prefer quarterbacks as much if they aren't putting Tom Brady. So I went with A, Jim Brown.
Joe Montana is the highest quarterback on the list, but he's not number one either. But neither is Jim Brown. The correct answer is actually Jerry Rice. Definitely one of the most dominant players in NFL history. But let's move on to question 4 now. Which of these Heisman winners were selected outside of the first round? Pretty rare for a Heisman winner. Is it A, Lamar Jackson, B, Derrick Henry, C, Johnny Manziel, or D, Mark Ingram? The first answer is Rohan again.
Yeah, it's got to be Derrick Henry. I know they're all first-round picks, but they're all pretty late. I think like, even Mark Ingram was like 30th or something. So it would be Derrick Henry.
Yup, that is correct. Derrick Henry was taken in the second round in one of the most stacked running back classes of all time. Now we have one more question. Hopefully Aki can get on the board for today here. Besides Bill Belichick, which head coach has been on their team for the longest? Is it A, Mike Tomlin, B, Sean Payton, C, Pete Carroll, or D, John Harbaugh? Once again, Rohan has the first guess.
This is a tough one. They've all been around for a while, but I feel like Mike Tomlin is kind of young, so I don't think he's been on the Steelers as the head coach for too long. Pete Carroll is really old, so it's like in the 70s or something. So I'm gonna have to go with Pete Carroll.
That is true. Pete Carroll is old, but unfortunately, he is the wrong answer. And Aki, what is your guess?
Even though he's young, I feel like Mike Tomlin's been around for a while. Like I know Pete Carroll came from like USC in like 2011, so it couldn't be him. And then like John Harbaugh or I don't know, whatever Harbaugh. Like I think he's also fairly recent. I forgot about the other person, but I put A, Mike Tomlin.
Yeah, Mike Tomlin, I think, is actually second. He was the youngest coach to ever win a Super Bowl. The correct answer was B, Sean Payton, who's been on the Saints for quite a long time. But that wraps it up for this week's trivia segment. And we'll move on to the main segment now.
All right, thanks for the trivia. Unfortunately, I couldn't make up any ground, but we're moving on to the main segment. So the main segment is where we talk a little bit more in detail about who were the best performers team-wise and player-wise this week, and we break down what the teams are going to be looking like, how strong they're looking after week 3, and how the players are doing. What are the best pickups on fantasy, and who are the best performers overall. So for fantasy, let's start with Andy.
All right, yeah, I'm just going to cover a few interesting categories, I guess, for fantasy. So a few players that you should definitely, they're definitely rostered in, I think, most leagues. You should probably start next week, or at least consider starting them, is Aaron Rodgers next week is probably someone that you might want to start, mainly because he is playing the Falcons, who are just like by far the worst defense against quarterbacks so far this year. We saw it in week 1. They played against Russ. Russ was the best quarterback in the league that week. Week 2, they played against Dak. He was the best quarterback in the league that week. And then week 3, they played the Bears. I mean, Trubisky didn't really play that well, but when Foles came in, he threw for 3 touchdowns in the final quarter. So you might want to be considering starting quarterbacks against the Falcons. We also have Devin Singletary, the Bills running back. He's coming off a pretty good week where he got like 121 total yards. And he's playing against the Raiders, who have just been absolutely like annihilated by running backs so far. They did hit some play against really good running backs. But CMC basically destroyed them. Kamara destroyed them. And even on Sunday, Rex Burkhead destroyed them as well, which was definitely a bit of a surprise. So you should definitely start Devin Singletary. And then finally, we have a tight end, TJ Hawkinson. So the Saints, for some reason, even though they have a pretty good defense, they just really struggle against tight ends. In all of the first 3 weeks, the tight ends scored like at least 1 touchdown against them. So you can maybe expect the same from TJ Hawkinson. In terms of some like waiver wire pickups, some players who are like not rostered in a lot of leagues, we have Justin Jefferson, who's only rostered in 33% of leagues. He's coming off an amazing week with 175 yards and a touchdown. I think the Vikings maybe first two games weren't perfectly like indicative of how good they can actually be, and they should probably return to playing at least like an okay level offensively for the rest of the season. We also have Jared Goff, who in the last two games has scored 6 touchdowns and only threw 1 pick. Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Tyler Higbee, they're all playing really well, and the Rams have been a very good offensive team recently. You should consider him. And finally, we have one that's very, very far-fetched, I guess. He's rostered in less than 1% of leagues. That's because he was a backup quarterback last week, but now he's not. It's Nick Foles, who threw for 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter when he was subbed in against the Falcons. Admittedly, it was the Falcons who are like known for blowing leads, but you might just consider putting him on your bench, see how he develops. He could be a very good player. So what do you guys think?
I definitely agree with all the players that you mentioned, but I just want to shout out another player that I think is a very solid waiver wire pickup. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, Myles Gaskin. I think the Dolphins are kind of doing this 3-headed running back core, but I think Myles Gaskin is definitely the main person in that 3-headed running back core, kind of like Raheem Mostert last year at the 49ers. I think in this past game, he got 22 carries, and he's also just throughout all 3 of the games, he's been very involved in the passing game. He had 4 receptions in game 1, 6 receptions in game 2, and 5 receptions in the most recent game in week 3. So I think he's averaging around 10 to 15 points consistently, which is very solid. And I think he's definitely a very good pickup for anyone that just needs a good backup running back. I think he's only rostered in 45% of leagues right now. So I think he's definitely a great pickup. But the reason why I say he's more of a long-term pickup is because next week he faces the Seahawks, who have a very good run defense. And yeah, even the Seahawks held Zeke to a very bad yard per carry, only like 1 or 2 yards per carry. And also they're facing the 49ers, and the Niners also have a pretty good run defense. But after that, they have a pretty easy schedule. They have the Broncos, the Chargers, and so on. So I think Myles Gaskin is definitely a person to consider.
Yeah, another one you would need to be looking out for, and a lot of people will be wanting to get him, especially considering how well he played yesterday, is going to be Alan Lazard. He put up 26.4 fantasy points against the Saints defense. So keep on the lookout for him, especially while Adams is out for a little bit. So and Aaron Rodgers, since he's firing on all cylinders, looks like Lazard will be stepping into that role. And next week he's facing the Atlanta Falcons. However, this is sort of like a 1-week rental sort of thing, or because week 5 he has a bye. And then after the bye week in week 6, he faces Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it looks like it's going to be a bit of a tougher matchup for him. But the interesting thing is that apparently Alan Lazard does well against good defenses and bad against bad defenses. Against the Lions, he only caught 3 passes for 45 yards, but versus the Saints, he caught 6 for 146, and then versus the Vikings, he caught 4 for 63 and a touchdown. So keep on the lookout for picking up Alan Lazard, especially considering the plethora of wide receiver injuries that are occurring.
All right, so that wraps it up for our fantasy segment. Now let's move on to our power ranking segment. I think we had this last week where I'm just going to rank the teams in the NFL from 1 to 10, only the first 10 teams, because obviously those are the most important, because those are the teams that are actually going to make the playoffs, and also it's just going to take too much time to do all 32 teams. So just starting off, I'm just going to list off the teams that are ranked 10 through 6, and then we can have a discussion right after that. So at number 10, I have the Titans. At 9, I have the Bucks. At 8, I have the Niners. At 7, I have the Patriots. And at 6, I have the Bills. So a notable team that I left off was the Bears and the Saints. I think the Saints, they're 1 and 2. I don't think that deserves to be in the top 10. Maybe in the top 15 though. And then the Bears, if you look at the teams they faced, although they may be 3-0, they faced some pretty bad opponents, and they've all been really close games. So I think in the future, like in the long run, they may not be, as good as they are right now record-wise. But I think right now they are doing pretty well, though. So yeah, what do you guys think, though?
I think the situation with the Saints is definitely interesting. Obviously, even though they have been playing pretty poorly, you could attribute that to maybe Michael Thomas being out. He's definitely kind of like Drew Brees' main target for those 4-yard slants and stuff. But really, you've seen Kamara has been playing extremely well in the absence of Thomas, and I feel like with Thomas back, the Saints will have like a very strong offense, and they could still be a top 10 team. Yeah, the Bears, I feel like, yeah, they shouldn't be there either. But I think also the Titans maybe shouldn't be there because of like similar logic to the Bears. They're only like averaging winning, like even though they're 3-0, they're averaging winning games at like by like 2 points like per game. And they beat like the Jaguars, which is not particularly impressive, and the Vikings who aren't impressive either. So I think the Titans should be maybe top 15, but not top 10.
Yeah, I agree with Andy here. I mean, the Titans beat the 0-3 Vikings by 1, and then they beat the Jacksonville Jaguars 3 points. So it's not looking too amazing for them, but they are 3-0, and I think they definitely have the ability to win close games. They're a clutch team. Now, as for a team like the Bills, I'm I'm still not totally convinced, especially considering the injury to a player like John Brown. And I think that's going to be a pretty big impact for the Bills team. And I still am not totally convinced by Josh Allen. I think that he is bound to, once he faces a really good team, he's going to struggle a lot. And if you look at the Buffalo Bills schedule coming up, they face the Raiders, then they face the Raiders, the Titans, then the Chiefs. So I think that's going to be a pretty telling stretch for the Bills. I think if they come out of this 5-1, then they are definitely a top 7 team. Otherwise, if they are 4-2 or 3-3, then they probably fall out of the top 10 for me.
Yeah, it was definitely very interesting. I'm actually a little bit surprised that none of you contested the Niners, because I know some people didn't really like how I favor the Niners a lot, but I do think the Niners had some very dominating victories after a very close loss to the Cardinals. I think the Niners definitely could have won that game, but just a couple of missed plays were made at the very end. But they did show that they were boss, especially considering they had 16 players out in both their games, and that includes their starting quarterback, their starting running back, their first string center, their second string center, two of their starting defensive linemen. I think that's very indicative, and two of their starting corners too. I think that definitely goes to show that the Niners are a very strong team, especially after they totally destroyed the Jets and the Giants. Even though they are the Jets and the Giants, they got absolutely destroyed, 30 or 40 to 10 in each of those games. And teams like the Steelers and the Bills actually had close matchups with each of those teams. So I think that was definitely a very interesting matchup to see. But yeah, let's move on to our next few teams. So at number 5 through 10, we have the Steelers. At 4, we have the Seahawks. At 3, we have the Packers. At 2, we have the Ravens. And at 1, we have the Chiefs. So I think the team that definitely needs to be discussed are the Packers. I think for the Ravens and Chiefs, we haven't really seen them play against each other yet. But I think they're still going to be 1 and 2 respectively. Even if it's a blowout or something like that, I think they're still 2 really strong teams, really strong offenses, and really strong defenses. But the Packers have been really, really good. I think they've been totally destroying their opponents. You could say that their opponents have been bad, but I think their opponents have been pretty good. I mean, the Lions are the Lions, and the Lions actually did beat the Cardinals. The Vikings are historically pretty good, but they just haven't been good recently. And the Saints are actually a pretty solid team, even though they may not have their 4-yard slant pass catcher, Pro Bowl wide receiver Michael Thomas. They still have a pretty solid defense. And the fact that the Packers were able to score so many points in all of their games shows that how good they can be offensively with all these threats, even without Devontae Adams too. players like Aaron Jones and Alan Lazard can step up and be very explosive players, I think that goes to show why the Packers are currently better than the Saints. Even without their star wide receiver, the Packers' offense was still really, really good. And also something else that I wanted to mention was that the Packers' defense may be a little bit concerning right now. The fact that they're able to let so many points in the past few games be scored, that's definitely something to look out for. But overall, I think the Packers are playing really well. What are your opinions on this?
Yeah, I think that I pretty much mostly agree. Obviously, 1 and 2, we'll just have one be whoever wins tonight. We don't really know. We're recording this on Monday. I think the Seahawks and Packers are the clear two best teams in the NFC so far. But I went with the Seahawks above the Packers, and this is just because I think that the Seahawks are more. I think they're just more like consistent, I guess, where they have like. I think they have more offensive weapons that are like consistently good every week. Whereas the Packers, you might get a really good performance from like MVS uh, or Alan Lazard. You could also get a terrible performance from them, and I think that's just slightly concerning. Whereas the Seahawks, you have a lot of good performers like Chris Carson when he's not injured, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf when he's not fumbling on the 1 yard line, and things like that. So I went with the Seahawks over the Packers, and then I also agree that the Steelers should be at 5.
Yeah, I also have the Seahawks above the Packers. And one interesting fact, Rohan, you're talking about the Saints defense. The Saints have allowed as many points as the New York Jets through 3 games. So I don't think that's a good look for the Saints defense. But if you're looking at the actual Packers, I'm really excited to see Aaron Rodgers. Like he sort of needed this push. Like, hey, you're going to be replaced soon by this rookie quarterback. What are you going to say for yourself? Are you really a 13-3 team? And the way they're playing, especially considering that they beat the New Orleans Saints, who many people thought were the favorite to come out of the NFC this year, it's quite amazing for Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. Looking at their upcoming schedule, they definitely have a pretty interesting set of games coming up. So after the Falcons, they face the Bucks, Texans, Vikings, and then 49ers. I think that, and 49ers is like week 7, week 8. So you probably will see Jimmy G back, Raheem Mostert back, and possibly Richard Sherman back. So it's going to be a slightly healthier 49ers team. I think that the Green Bay Packers, since the way that they're playing, and I think that they will go like 6-1. They'll be 6-1 through slate of games, or 7-1. And I think that based off their extremely amazing offense, keep in mind they didn't have Devontae Adams this week, and they had I'm forgetting their DT Kenny Clark. He was out. He's out still, but yeah, that is looking really promising for them. But I still have the Seahawks over them. They were just amazing, and Russell Wilson is a god. All right, so that wraps it up for our top 10. Now we're going to be moving on to the team of week 3, team of the week. So basically, I'm going to give 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 box player, that is defensive lineman and like linebackers right around there, and then 1 player on the secondary and 1 kicker. So let's start with the offense. So for tight end, there weren't too many amazing games, but I had to go with Jimmy Graham. He had a really solid game this week. Many people at the start of the season were a bit like confused as to why Jimmy Graham was signed. That there were already a couple of good tight ends on the team, so it was really interesting to see him do well this week. And it's always good to see a player like a player like him do really well. So it was really nice to see him put up, I think, like 24 fantasy points this week, and he had a bunch of yards. It's kind of uncharacteristic of like a slightly older player like him. But there wasn't too much from the tight end side. The more interesting conversation is going to be with the running backs and wide receivers. So I'll go with the quarterback. I think you have to give this to Russell. 5 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. That's absolutely amazing, and he led the Seahawks to a win over the Cowboys. It should have been 6 touchdowns, but unfortunately, DK Metcalf had a very interesting decision-making process. So that was unfortunate. So now we go on to the running backs. So for the running backs, there's basically two players who sort of stood up above the rest. So they were they were Dalvin Cook, who had 181 yards on several carries. Obviously, that was really good considering he wasn't playing too well in the first couple of weeks of the season. It's nice to see a terrible Vikings team actually get a bit of hope. And the next is Alvin Kamara, who, although if you look at his rushing yards, didn't have too many amazing places. He had like over 130 receiving yards. That was really good for Alvin Kamara and the Saints offense, even though they took an L. And the last thing for the offense before we go into full-out discussion is the wide receiver core. And I think that is going to be a really interesting conversation because there were like 5 or 6 wide receivers who played extremely well. I ultimately considered Tyler Lockett, Justin Jefferson, Alan Lazard, and Keenan Allen. And I ultimately went with the rookie Justin Jefferson and Tyler Lockett. So Justin Jefferson this week, he had, I think, like 7 catches for 170 yards, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, that was really cool to see a rookie like that. The Eagles are probably kicking themselves right now for taking Jalen Reagor over him, or the Oakland Henry Ruggs hasn't looked too solid, and Jerry Jeudy's injured. So Justin Jefferson's looking pretty solid thus far, with especially after a performance like this. And the other player which I had was Tyler Lockett, who caught several, I think 3 touchdowns from Russell Wilson, which was probably the ultimate deciding factor, the ultimate deciding factor for the Seahawks versus the Cowboys game.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you here. I think tight end, there wasn't a lot of great ones, but Jimmy Graham definitely stood out with 2 touchdowns. Quarterback is pretty obvious. I think just Russell Wilson is just like insane. When it comes to running back, I do agree with having Kamara in there. He had like almost 200 total yards and coupled that with 2 touchdowns. Dalvin Cook, I definitely think could be in there, but the one that I went with is Derrick Henry. He had not quite as many yards. I think he had 130 total yards, but he did like couple that or pair that with 2 touchdowns, which was nice. And those 2 touchdowns were like really crucial to the Titans win, as they only won by like 1 point. So I think Derrick Henry, and he was actually the only Titan to score a touchdown because like all the rest of the points were from Gostkowski. But yeah, I went with Derrick Henry.
Yeah, for me too, I think the running back position was definitely, I do agree with the players that you put there, but I think I almost want to give a shout out to Austin Eckler. He had a really good game. It was kind of like a slightly worse performance compared to Kamara's, but he had 11 receptions, which is absolutely insane for a running back, for 84 yards. And this is alongside Keenan Allen, who also had a pretty massive receiving game. So I think that in and of itself is really impressive, especially since Austin Eckler had to kind of compete with other players for the receptions, unlike the Saints, where, to be honest, Alvin Kamara is the #1 receiver without Michael Thomas and his 4-yard slants. So I think Austin Eckler definitely deserves a shout out. But the thing is, he did lose his game, so that's a little bit concerning. And it was against the Panthers. But I don't know if that was his fault because he did play pretty well. And he did have a rushing touchdown as well. So I think from scrimmage, he had like 150 yards, which is pretty impressive. So I think he definitely deserves an honorable mention.
All right, so now we're going to be moving on to the defense. So just a recap, we're going to be having 1 player from the box, 1 player secondary, and I guess I didn't put the kicker, so I'm just going to have special teams also. Defense is not really measured a lot by stats, but if you look at the overall play, if you watch the game and you see the way players were getting tackles, the ways the players were assisting tackles, they were making running backs having to avoid them, causing loss of yards or less yards overall. It's really nice to see, or just shutting down really good wide receivers. It's always a good idea to look at these defensive players. So for the box, There were several really good players who had a bunch of sacks. I think there were at least 3 or 4 players who had multiple sacks this week, which is always really nice to see. But ultimately, the person who I went with was Carl Lawson. Now, you might not know who Carl Lawson is, and that's perfectly reasonable. Carl Lawson isn't one of your big name players in the NFL. He's been he doesn't put up amazing stats. In fact, this season, this past week was really an anomaly for him. In his entire career, he has had 17 and a half sacks in his entire career, and like 59 tackles. So it's not like amazing or anything. But this week he had 2 sacks and a forced fumble, and he had 8 tackles, which is really good for a box player. So shout out to him. It's the beauty of football. You can have these players who just put in the work, and even though they don't always show up on the stat sheet, they have really good games. So I ultimately gave it to Carl Lawson. And for the secondary, I think it was pretty obvious. One player who was a bit notorious last year for letting a couple of wide receivers have huge games on him. He got 2 interceptions. One of them was returned for a touchdown. Yes, we are talking about the Colts' Xavier Rhodes. He had a really good game, 2 interceptions, and as I said, 1 return for a touchdown. I think the Colts defense had like 2 picks returned for a touchdown, which was really surprising. I don't know if we've had 2 pick sixes in a game for a while. And lastly, for special teams, there's 1 kicker, and this kicker, after a struggling performance in week 1 where he ended up hitting the game winner, came back in week 2 and had a really solid game. And then this week, he had 6 field goals. 3 of them were, I think, from beyond 50. And he got, I think, 25 fantasy points for a kicker, which is absolutely insane. He is Steven Gostkowski, the former Patriots kicker. So yeah, he was absolutely insane. He was one of the primary reasons why the Titans were so good this week.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with the secondary and kicker. I think those are fairly obvious. For the box, another player I wanted to just mention though was Shaq Thompson, a linebacker from the Panthers. He had 13 tackles, which was second only to Jordan Poyer. He also forced a fumble, which is always nice. And in total, the Panthers only allowed 16 points to the Chargers, which is pretty impressive. It's kind of like the main reason why the Chargers, he was kind of a big factor as why the Chargers run game wasn't very successful mostly. I know Austin Eckler was very good, but he was mostly successful through the receiving game. So I think Shaq Thompson deserves a shout out at least.
Yeah, for me too, I definitely agree with your secondary and kicker positions. I think those Steven Gostkowski and Xavier Rhodes had some really solid games. But in my opinion, I think I'm gonna have to give the box player team of the week to Shaq Barrett. So I think there's definitely a lot of players for this position, for this box thing. There are just so many good players and so many different teams. It's really hard to measure it. But in my opinion, I think Shaq Barrett did deserve it, and this is for several reasons. So first of all, I think he was the #1 Bucks defensive line person. So he's always picking up the best offensive tackles, and he's also getting double teamed in some situations. So I think he also has a way more difficult path to getting sacks and stuff. So in particular, the Bucks defense just totally destroyed the Broncos. I think the Bucks defense had 6 sacks in total, and 2 of them came from Shaq Barrett. And those are some pretty solid sacks just by watching the game. But if you look even further, he actually got a safety too. I think safeties are really rare, and it takes a lot of skill to get safeties, because especially when you're in your own territory, the offensive line tries extra hard. I mean, they're always trying hard, but they're trying even harder than normal. So I think the fact that he's getting double teamed, he's picking up the best offensive lineman, and he got a safety. I think that definitely shows that he's really good, and he's probably the main leader on the Bucks defense. Devin White is pretty good, but I think Shaq Barrett is definitely the main person, in my opinion.
Yeah, that wraps it up for the team of the week for week 3. Now we move on to hot takes.
All right, now it's time for hot takes. And as you all know, this is a segment where each of us makes a potentially controversial prediction or statement about something that's going to happen in the NFL. So I'm going to talk about the Titans, and specifically, I think the Titans are not going to make the playoffs this year. And that can be a pretty big hot take, especially considering how hot they were looking last season. I get it. But also, just looking at the other teams in their division, I think the Titans definitely are the expected team to win, and they've started 3-0 too. But I think that the Colts are going to take the divisional leader title, and this is for a couple of reasons. If you just look at the Titans' performance so far, they may be 3-0 on paper, but if you look at their actual performances, they've been pretty bad. I know their defense has been quite terrible against some of the worst offenses in the league. They've only won by like 1 to 3 points in each of their games, which is quite lucky, like just winning by field goals. I don't think that's a good way or a consistent way to win. And also, another thing to note is that AJ Brown is also injured and he's out for a couple of more weeks. He had a pretty bad bone bruise, which is always just sounds really painful and bad. So hopefully he can recover soon. But unfortunately, just by the way it looks, it's going to be at least 5 weeks until he returns. So that's going to be a pretty big hit for the Titans offense. And also another thing to note is that Derrick Henry, although he played pretty well last week. Look at the first two games, he got like 30 carries and only averaged 2 to 3 yards per carry. I think that's definitely somewhat concerning, especially considering Derrick Henry is known for his yards after contact. I think he'll definitely recover from this, but that's just something to note. He just hasn't been as efficient as he has in the past. But then, if you look at the Colts offense, their offense has been quite good, and their defense has also been really good. I guess the game against the Jaguars was a little bit of a fluke. Phillip Rivers just threw 2 interceptions, but he was passing really well, though, and a lot of receivers got a lot of receptions. The run game was all right, too, though. It wasn't too impressive. I think that's the one aspect of the game that they can still work on. But they do have rookie Jonathan Taylor, who does have a lot of potential, and their defense has been really good against the Vikings and the Jets. I mean, they may not be the best teams, but they are still pretty decent teams, and the fact that they completely shut them out shows something indicative of their future. But then, if you just look at the schedule, like the future schedules for these two teams, I think they both have pretty similar schedules in terms of difficulty. But I think the Colts' defense has been so good. Their offense has also been pretty solid too. So I think the Colts definitely have a better chance at winning. So if the Titans don't get the divisional leader title, I think the reason why they're not making the playoffs is because if you look at the AFC North with the Steelers and Ravens. I think probably the Steelers are going to get the wild card spot, and then the Chiefs and the Raiders. I think the Raiders are just getting lucky, so I don't think the Raiders are going to get a playoff spot. But if you look at the AFC East with the Bills and Patriots, those two teams are clearly better than the Titans, in my opinion, as of right now. So I think the Bills and the Patriots, one of them will get the wild card spot. So for that reason, I don't have the Titans making the playoffs, but this is definitely subject to change as it is only week 3.
Yeah, my hot take is a little bit different. Mine is going to be about what will be the most entertaining and like good game of football to watch. And surprisingly, it's going to be the one between two 0-3 teams. I know it's quite surprising, and for me, it was quite surprising that these teams are 0-3 in the first place. But I think that the best matchup will be the Houston Texans facing off against the Minnesota Vikings. I think that they are two really strong teams who have something to prove. Their quarterbacks have been all right or downright awful in the case of Kirk Cousins. And they have good teams. Like they have shown potential to be able to win, but have come just short. Like if you look at last week, Houston lost on a game-winning drive by Pittsburgh with like a few minutes left, and Minnesota lost to the powerful leg of Steven Gostkowski in a 1-point loss. And I think that they play probably more like 2-1 teams or like 2-2 teams, I guess, because it's week 4, than like 0-3 teams, 0-4 teams. And the fact that one of these teams is going to be 0-4 to start the season is going to be absolutely pathetic. I personally will have the Texans winning this game by a field goal, but I think that it's going to be a really good matchup.
All right, yeah, my hot take is kind of a little bit similar to Rohan's. I'm also going to be talking about the Titans, but more specifically, just their game next week against the Steelers. And my personal opinion is that they're going to be like annihilated, basically. So when you look at the Titans so far, they're barely winning games against like trash teams. Like they're averaging, like they won one by like one, and then another by two, and another by three. The only reason they beat the Vikings is because they had to rely on 3 50-yard field goals. And the Vikings actually failed a 2-point conversion. So if the Vikings had made that 2-point conversion, they probably would have lost. And when you look at kind of the defenses that they've come up against so far, they played against the Broncos, and I believe they only scored about 16 points against the Broncos defense, which is pretty like lackluster, I guess. And then they also played against the Jaguars and the Dolphins, who let up around like 30 points each to them. But those were like really terrible defenses, whereas the Broncos are actually pretty decent defense. But the Steelers are even better. So I think if the Broncos can like shut down the Titans, then so can the Steelers. And just on the other side of the ball, I guess, like with the Titans on defense, they've allowed 450 like plus yards against both the Vikings and the Jaguars, who have pretty like bad offenses, which is pretty concerning. When they come up against an offense like the Steelers, who has like Big Ben, Juju, and like James Conner, and even like Deontay Johnson, and things like that, they're just going to get destroyed on both sides of the ball. I think it's going to be 31-13, an 18-point loss, which is like 3 scores. So yeah, that wraps it up for my hot take. And that's the end of this whole episode, actually. So we'll definitely see how all of these predictions play out soon enough. But this is the Benchwarmers signing off. See ya.